Are we good, Hobie?
All right, all set.
All right. I will call the meeting of the Bend MPO Technical Advisory Committee to order and jump ahead here. Hobie, do you want to walk through attendance?
Yeah. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the MPO Technical Advisory Committee. So today I'm just going to go through and say who is present, so you don't have to unmute or anything at this point. Cameron, you have your hand up,
Yes.
so go ahead.
Are we recording? Because it doesn't show on my end.
I thought I had, let's see. No, thank you. All right.
There we go. Thank you.
Now it is. Thank you so much. Okay. So I'm going to go through the TAC members that are voting members, and then ex officio after that, and then guests. And it'll just be a moment as I get a couple more people onto our panelists. Okay, so Sharon Smith is here with Bend Lapine Schools, Henry Stroud with Park and Rec, Robin Lewis, City of Bend. For CET, we've got Rachel Zackham right now, and Andrea Bro will be here shortly. Liza Hamada is community member, and she is coming on right now. Brian Potwin with Commute Options, Peter Russell with Deschutes County, Dave Thompson with Deschutes Bike and Ped Advisory Committee. Let's see. That is all four voting members. Rachel Chapika is here from Federal Highways. Hi, Rachel. And let's see, Teresa Conley is here for ODOT. I don't know if she's here for Rick Williams with ODOT, but she is attending. Oh, there you are, Rick. I'm sorry, I missed you in the rush. Hi, Rick. Okay, so Rick Williams is here with ODOT Region 4. For guests, we have DLCD staff, Evan Manville, and I'm trying to find everybody. There we go. Bill Holmstrom, and where did you go, Andy? Angie Brewer. And then we have a couple of others, Ariel Mendez, Sarah Anselman, and Teresa Conley attending our meeting as well. And Cody Meyer, sorry, I missed you. So welcome, I think, Kevin Young. Thank you so much. Yeah. I think we got everybody. Welcome and thank you for attending. The MPO staff is Tyler Diekey as the manager, Andrea Napoli, senior planner, and myself, Hobie Anderson, program coordinator. Cameron Prow is our recorder today, so she'll be making sure that we vote right and do all of the meeting rules and forums and that sort of thing. So thank you so much. Next slide is just our virtual meeting guidelines. Remember to mute if you need to and raise your hand anytime you have a comment. You know, you might have to wait for a little bit, but we'll get to your comments throughout the meeting. There's also room for public comment in the beginning and at the end of the meeting. So, thank you so much. This meeting is being recorded and it is also on YouTube. So if you want to share it out with any other coworkers, I know I've got a couple people that are conflicting and would like to see this presentation. So it will be available after, right after the meeting, and you can stream it now too. One more person, Robin Bora just came in, and I don't know if you can see Liza Hamada, but she is here as well. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Hobie. Keep moving here. Next agenda item is just a review and approval of our meeting minutes. They were included in your packet as attachment A for the TAC members. So just looking, well, number one, does anyone have any questions before we jump in? And if not, looking for a motion to approve those minutes.
I move to approve the March 2nd, 2022 draft meeting minutes as presented.
I'll second.
All right. Any discussion? If not, all in favor?
Aye.
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 All right, thank you. And our next agenda item is just an update, an overview and update on the climate friendly and equitable communities rulemaking process. And I believe Evan is going to lead that discussion. But we do have, several other DLCD staff members with us. So I will stop sharing my screen, Evan, and you can pull up your presentation.
Thank you. Bill, do you want to pull it up or do you want me to? Thank you, Bill. So Bill Holmstrom and Kevin Young, who are with us, are their project co-managers, but I am one of the team members, along with Cody Meyer and many other people assisting. So, of course, Angie Brewer connecting to you all. So thank you all for your time this morning. I'm Evan Manville. I'm a climate mitigation planner here, he, him pronouns. We are engaged in a big rulemaking effort. Next slide. So we want to just start at the start. This rulemaking effort is in part an outpouring of our boss's order, Executive Order 2004, to a bunch of state agencies asking us to take climate change seriously and redouble our efforts because we're not on track to meet Oregon's climate pollution reduction goals. So she directed a bunch of agencies to do a bunch of different things, in part directed us and to work in partnership with ODOT to address transportation pollution related to land use and update our land use and transportation planning rules and find some resources to help you all implement it at a local level. In doing so, to think about historically marginalized communities and center equity concerns as we did that. Next slide. So as noted, we are significantly off track in meeting the legislature's adopted pollution reduction goals. They adopted goals in 2007. And on our current path, given current trends and investments and policies, we're gonna emit about 4 times as much pollution in 2050 from transportation as our goal. So that has real world impacts on Oregonians. We've been seeing people lose their homes and their lives due to wildfires and extreme heat events. People have business impacts, shellfish farming, for example, other farming. It's impacting us already, and those extreme weather events are likely to be more frequent and more extreme in the years to come, particularly if we don't redirect ourselves to meeting our goals. Next slide. So the other thrust of this rulemaking, as you might have noticed from its title, is equity. And land use and transportation in Oregon have a pretty significant connection to inequity, where we've located our highways, what we've done with our land use planning decisions is kind of built on the history of redlining and kind of concentrating wealth among the privileged white people generally, and not allowing those same government supports for other populations. And so that has an intergenerational impact because most intergenerational wealth is from housing. And that's why a large part of why the average white household today has about 10 times as much as the average Black household. And there's a huge home ownership gap. So lots of work to undo and to consider as we're doing this rulemaking. Next slide. The rulemaking applies to where most Oregonians live and where most transportation pollution happens, just the 8 metro areas, including Bend. Communities outside those metro areas are not impacted by this rulemaking. The biggest bang in the buck is focusing on these 8 metro areas. So that's what our commission directed us to do. Next slide. Throughout this rulemaking, we've been engaging folks in all sorts of different ways for the last 2 years. Both interviews to start out and a broad, diverse advisory committee, including reps from all those 8 metro areas and traditionally included voices. Lots of meetings, lots of hearings, lots of check-ins with folks, trying to really craft something that works for the 8 metro areas. And I would note at the end here, Community engagement will continue because a lot of these rules will be adopted depending on what local communities want. And we've got some funding from the legislature to help with that implementation, that engagement in implementation. So it's been an extensive process, and we're nearing the end of the rulemaking part of it and starting, which is scheduled for May 19th, 20th. So next slide. Our commission directed us to kind of take actions in 2 tracks. The first is kind of helping regions set up a plan that says, hey, how can your region meet its pollution reduction goals? What mix of policies and actions? And the Portland metro area already did that. They were directed by the legislature about 10 years ago to do that and adopted something in 2014 but the other regions haven't done that analysis. Besides Lane, Eugene, Springfield did theirs, but they didn't adopt it. So anyway, too many details. So that's the one track. The second track is updating Oregon's land use and transportation rules, as I previously mentioned, in 6 main areas, and we'll get to those. Next slide. So under that first jack of regional planning, until we get to regional scenario planning for each of those 8 metro or the 7 regions that haven't done it, this is kind of the, oh, Cody, this is your slide if you're.
Sure, thanks, Evan. Good morning, everyone. I'm Cody Meyer, Land Use Transportation Planner with DLCD. Just a kind of thumbnail here of how we're connecting our regional greenhouse gas targets and our kind of scenario planning program to the local plans for areas that aren't directed to do scenario planning or don't wish to volunteer into that. So really we have the statewide transportation strategy, which was adopted by the OTC a number of years ago, is created in 2012. And our greenhouse gas targets are really tightly woven into that. And so what that is it gives us an understanding of what are the levels of actions that need to occur for the state to meet its transportation emissions reduction goals. And these levels and actions range from anything from big statewide policy on like a cap and trade program or the climate protection program that DEQ just adopted, road pricing in some of the larger metro areas of Portland, and then even down to every metropolitan area, what's the kind of transit we need in each size metro area? What are the amount of homes living in mixed use areas? So they kind of give us a good goalpost for how much of each action needs to occur in each metro area. So we're proposing to our commission that we use that to identify what are the gaps between currently adopted plans in these different categories and the STS or the kind of our default greenhouse gas target level of ambition. And so that'll really be used to set out a performance-based planning system for local plans to say, what are the local actions and the performance measures and targets associated with those to do a gap analysis and to identify corrective actions over the reporting period. Since we're at MPO here, I'd just like to say we're proposing that this reporting occurs in whatever year the RTP is adopted. So some regions are in a 4-year cycle, some regions are a 5-year cycle. So we're just saying to kind of sync up, have the cities sync up their reporting with that RTP. So we're kind of all collecting data and reporting at the same time. We're not saying it has to be as a part of the RTP, but there's a lot of good information that comes out of those plans that we want to make sure that we have cities able to access that or vice versa. And then between there, we just, hopefully we're implementing plans and then we kind of go around, we report back out on the 4 or 5 year cycle and identify what's working, what needs course correction, and just keep repeating. So happy to answer any questions or maybe just get through the presentation and chat later.
All right. We'll zoom through and then answer questions. Yeah. These are the 6 areas that I mentioned before. Climate friendly areas, reforming parking management, EV charging, high quality walking, biking, transit. thinking about measuring success and transportation projects beyond just congestion, and developing a project list that really directs us to get to those climate and equity outcomes. Next slide. Kevin.
All right, I think this is where I come in. Thank you, Evan. Kevin Young, I'm he, him pronouns. I'm the department's senior urban planner. And I've been working on the climate-friendly area requirements under this rule. So first of all, what is a climate-friendly area? Important question. Everyone is probably familiar with what these are. They're walkable mixed-use areas that allow, mixture of uses, residential, office, retail, services, public uses. You find these areas a lot of times in the older portions of our downtowns in cities in Oregon, where before we moved with such enthusiasm to single use or, to Euclidean zoning, things evolved more organically in downtowns, and we had a kind of mixture of uses that would occur. The reason this is important is this, as Cody alluded to, the statewide transportation strategy really provides a roadmap for how to meet identified GHG reduction targets, and the land use piece is an important part of that. So establishing more climate-friendly areas establishes areas where people are less dependent on automobiles to meet their daily needs. And so the goal from the statewide transportation strategy is to realize 30% of people in these urban areas living within climate-friendly areas by the year 2035. And so the draft rules are kind of establishing that target and asking local governments to basically zone these areas to accommodate at least 30% of housing needs. This would be all local governments with population above 10,000 is the requirement. There is a smaller requirement for cities between 5 and 10,000 population, but it will not apply to the Bend MPO area. Again, it's important to stress that what we're requiring is zoning to accommodate that portion of identified housing needs. There's been concern expressed as we've been developing these rules that somehow we're locking up 30% of residential land areas for these needs and precluding residential development elsewhere. That is in fact not the case. What we're doing is we're expanding accommodation for residential development in these mixed use areas. So it doesn't count against a community's land need or residential land needs. And I can go into more detail on that if people have questions. But anyway, climate-friendly areas associated with these requirements are requirements for high-quality pedestrian, bicycle, and transit services, as you would expect. We want to provide good alternative transportation options for people who live and work in these areas. We also have elements of parking reform within these areas so that we have less of an emphasis on accommodating the automobile and more emphasis on making more efficient use of land in these areas. The rules allow for abutting high-density residential or employment areas to be included as climate-friendly areas because that actually helps to improve the performance of the climate-friendly area. And then the current draft of the rules allows local governments to choose from two options. One is a prescriptive option, and the other is an outcome-based standard. And I'll talk about those on the next slide. Okay, so this chart kind of shows you both paths, the blue, purple, whatever in the middle there, prescriptive standards, and then on the right-hand side, the outcome-oriented standards. And these are all scaled based on population. So for Bend, obviously, they're the largest size city, 50,000 and above. Bend would be required per the rules to designate climate-friendly areas within the city, and the rules require designation of what we're calling a primary CFA or a primary climate friendly area. That area needs to be at least 25 acres in size, and it would either, if the prescriptive path is chosen, would require 25 dwelling units per net acre for any purely residential development in that area, so fairly high residential densities, and would allow for building heights up to 85 feet. Certainly not a requirement for buildings to be constructed to that height, but all an allowance for building heights to that height. Outside that primary CFA or climate friendly area, local governments are also allowed to designate other, what I'm calling satellite CFA areas. And those areas can be done at a less intensive level. So City of Bend could say, oh, we'd like to have this neighborhood hub area developed at, say, 15 dwelling units per acre minimum and a 50-foot allowed building height if they choose to do so. The other path is an outcome-oriented standard, which basically allows the local government to say, hey, we have a set of development standards that will result in the level of development we need to see, or potentially we're developing a set of development standards that will achieve these outcomes. And those outcomes are listed here. So for the most intensive communities, our goal is to have a set of development standards that would allow for 40 homes and jobs per net acre. So relatively intensive uses. Next slide, please. So in terms of implementation, the timelines in the draft rules are, first of all, a study of potential climate-friendly areas. So that study would be submitted to the department for review and comment by June 30 of 2023. So it is not a land use decision. It's essentially saying, hey, we've done our due diligence. We've looked at potential climate-friendly areas. One important piece of that is an analysis of equitable housing outcomes. And, one of the things that we want to be aware of and cognizant of as we're considering zoning these areas are potential negative consequences, displacement that could occur. And we're asking that as part of that analysis, local governments also look at mitigation measures that might be utilized to mitigate for displacement that might occur. Happy to say that we're working with Oregon Housing and Community Services to operationalize a statewide mapping application to assist with that analysis. And we also have an anti-displacement and gentrification toolkit that local governments can use to do that analysis. That's the first phase. The second phase is adopting zoning and comp plan amendments by June 30 of 2024.
Hey, Kevin, Sharon
Yeah.
Smith has her hand up. Do you want questions as you move through or at the end? Or
I think we can be flexible. Sure.
go ahead, Sharon.
Thanks. Could you go back one slide, please? Help me understand what 40 homes and jobs net per acre. How do you measure that?
So that is essentially looking at dwelling units per acre or employment densities per acre. So in this context, one way a local government might prove up on that is to say, hey, we've had this code in existence for some time. Here's some developments that have been done in these areas that might achieve that standard, or here's a way in which development could be done to these standards that would achieve that goal. I didn't mention too, the outcome-oriented standards would be applied similarly to the prescriptive standards in terms of, again, that primary CFA that's most intensive, and then the ability to sort of do less intensive CFAs elsewhere to different outcome-oriented standards if the local government chooses to do so.
So follow up, how do you measure that in like a mixed use area? Can you add them together, or I guess I'm not understanding what the method
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think there's a couple of different ways. So, on its face, you could look at a single development site that might have a mixture of uses. And okay, we've got both, say it's a single building that has both homes and jobs. Okay, if that's achievable under the code, then you're good. You might also just say, hey, generally in this area, we've got the ability to put in a, relatively high density, residential development and a relatively intensive employment use in the zone.
So maybe I'm being too concrete, but if, let's say you had a single development that's a high-rise mixed use, so commercial on the bottom, some residential and some offices, and you can show that the code would allow 10 homes and 30 jobs, like, or 20 and 20, or how do you measure it?
Oh, I see. No, actually what we're looking for there in the most intensive area is an average of 40 homes and jobs per net acre. So if we were looking at, say, a 1 acre development site, we would be looking for 40 homes, 40 jobs within that 1 acre area. Now it could be more than one building. It could be one, large mixed use building. It's, either way.
Looks like we have Robin Bora's hand up too. You want to go ahead, Robin?
Yeah, just to clarify Sharon's question. So you're talking about that's an and 40 homes and 40 jobs, or 40 homes or 40 jobs?
And.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so we were done there. Okay, I think this might be my last slide, but some important rule amendments that are also associated with this work is amendments to our statewide housing rule, Division 8, as we refer to it. This requires cities with a population over 10,000 to monitor and report on housing production in climate-friendly areas as part of the housing production strategy work that's now required under House Bill 2003. So Bend will be reporting on housing production strategies every 8 years, looking at overall, housing production and the tools that they've been using to promote affordable housing development and other types of housing development in the area. This simply adds to that requirement to say we want to focus also, and we want data also on housing production just in climate friendly areas, including affordable and housing for persons with disabilities. And then lastly, beginning June 30, 2027, urban growth boundary expansions that are based on residential needs would trigger additional climate-friendly area designation. And that would be enough to accommodate the equivalent of half of the additional residential need. It's not, the way this operates, it doesn't say half of the residential needs must be accommodated in climate-friendly areas. So it doesn't take away land from other residential needs, but it says concurrent with that UGB expansion is the requirement for local governments to designate additional climate-friendly areas. And I think that's it for the climate-friendly area stuff. I think I see
one more question. Go ahead, Sharon, and then Henry.
Sorry. So the second point here, beginning in June of 2027, what happens if a jurisdiction has a pending UGB expansion when that deadline hits? How does the rule work in that context?
Oh, that's a good question. So based on residential needs. So I think it would depend on when the UGB expansion decision was made. If it were made after June 30, 2027, it would trigger the this additional designation requirement. If the decision were made prior to that date, it would not be subject to the requirement.
So a jurisdiction that was in the process for a couple of years and just didn't make it across the finish line would have to start over?
Well, it is not a kind of a start over thing as much as it is an associated requirement. So it is basically saying, okay, concurrent with that urban growth boundary expansion, which, okay, that's this area where we've identified our residential needs. We expand that area. This local government would also need to, study potential climate-friendly areas and then designate and zone those climate-friendly areas concurrent with the UGB expansion.
Got it.
Okay.
Should I go?
Henry. Yep.
Yeah, Kevin, thanks. This is really, really good information. I think it's clarifying a lot of things, or my understanding of what's going on. So I work for the Park District, and we're particularly interested in how DLCD expects cities to implement these changes. And just to give you a little perspective, one of the things that we're wrestling with is, as our cities become more dense, it's harder and harder for us to purchase land to provide the necessary areas for parks, for recreation, for bike and ped friendly transportation, which we're really involved in. So is DLCD going to be providing the cities with model legislation? Are there any best practices, or is it kind of like, hey, it's up to the local municipalities to figure out how to meet these goals?
It's a good question. We do anticipate that we will be developing guidance once the rules are adopted and we're very clear on what they will say. I can't say whether that will get to the level of a model code, but I will say that the prescriptive standards path is fairly straightforward. The requirements there are minimum residential densities and allowed building heights, and so that piece of it we don't expect would create a lot of complications in terms of development code amendments. There's quite a bit of local government discretion in terms of, how they integrate that into their current development code requirements.
Are there performance requirements? So you talked about the cities changing their code to allow for a maximum building height or higher net densities. Is there also going to be a check-in to see if they're doing it? Because I guess the perspective here is, a lot of the mechanisms that we see municipalities using, particularly more carrot-based approach for developers like tax abatement and some of these other things, have the kind of secondary effect of eroding our base and our ability to purchase land and participate in these more metropolitan type areas based on the models that we have for acquisition and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so the monitoring that we'll do will happen through that housing production strategy tool where local governments are reporting on housing production in climate friendly areas. Okay. And we'll be looking at that. Honestly, what we're trying to do is structure things so that the market responds. We know that cities can't require development to occur in certain areas, but we're trying to create circumstances in which climate friendly development can most easily occur. Yeah, and so we expect over time local governments might adjust their strategies to promote that development in those areas. We may identify, we're hopeful that we'll identify some good tools that are useful in creating affordable housing in these areas as well as just general housing in those areas.
That's good, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead, Rick.
Just curious, is there anything in the rules that would help address the inequity in housing prices between areas and how that affects commuting? Because I understand, the MPO here is basically the city of Bend, but we still have significant differences in housing prices in the outlying areas. And I'm hoping the rule doesn't exacerbate the more people commuting from Redmond, Sisters, and Prineville into Bend every day, just because the housing is cheaper, and these elements might actually, an unintended consequence might increase that. Is there something in the, because I'm not overly familiar with the rules, is there something in there that kind of addresses that you're doing this in Bend, but what's that do to a Redmond or a Prineville or a Sisters and our overall commute shed?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good point, Rick. The way we've designed these rules is very carefully to not take residential lands away from other development that has and will continue to occur in cities. We're adding additional housing capacity in climate friendly areas. We know some people will want to live in those areas for a variety of reasons, but it will not take land away from meeting other residential needs. The other point too is that, we're hearing this point a lot, this concern a lot. And I understand that a lot of local governments kind of look at single family detached residential as being sort of the primary housing type that their communities need. The reality is that that housing type is the most expensive product on the market these days, and it is becoming less and less affordable to, people are making median household income for the region. So with middle housing allowances that are now coming into play to allow for more compact, more affordable housing types in some of those neighborhoods, as well as the types of development that will be allowed in climate-friendly areas, which may include attached single family, which is also a great, step to home ownership for a lot of people that's more affordable than single family detached. We see it as providing actually more housing opportunities than are currently available.
Yeah, thanks for the feedback. I think part of it is you mentioned like local governments might feel the attachment to single family homes, but I think local governments feel the pressure from the existing development community where that's what they've been doing for so long. And we might need some sort of encouragement to actually support this new style of development. I should say new to certain areas, not new to the country as a whole. And I just don't know the nuances of the rule if there's things in there to support that sort of thing. But thank you for the feedback. I do appreciate it.
You bet. You bet. I didn't mention, there are pieces to support affordable housing development within climate friendly areas specifically. We had our first hearing with the commission last week, and we got specific direction that, hey, you need to include those with the climate friendly area regulations. So that will be the next iteration. You'll see a kind of a more emphasis on affordable housing within these areas as well.
So I guess I'm up.
Yep.
So I was going to ask the one question Rick already asked. So my other thought was going back to Sharon's question about timing rule. So it'd be when the UGB application was filed with the local government, not when the decision was made. So if you're before that deadline, you're usually pretty good. There could be some nuance if you've got a 30-day completeness check or not, but it's not when the UGB decision is made, it's when it's applied for at the local government.
Yeah, Peter, I'm sorry, you may be right there. I think typically we would look at when the post-acknowledgement plan amendment was filed. So usually there's a notice of a proposed amendment and then notice of adoption. I can get you a more precise answer to that question if the group would like that. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I shouldn't
the old 35-day notice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Hey, Sharon.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, I was wondering if maybe this legislation had some different, or it's not legislation, I guess, tried to change the goalpost bill, but let's get the clarification. That would be appreciated.
You bet. I will do
and
that.
then as I'm kind of visualizing, processing kind of what this area would look like, can you give us an example of a development that has met that 40 job, 40 residential net per acre? What would that look like? Is there an example that meets that goal that you could provide?
Yeah, I'm sure there are. I can't think of one in particular. I will say I shared with the commission last week. I was really focused on residential development. And so I provided some examples of residential development in Corvallis, which is a community where I've lived and worked for many years, that far exceeded some of those minimum density requirements. Now, I wasn't really looking at employment numbers as well, but many of those sites are a fraction of an acre. And so it's conceivable you might have a freestanding residential building that's set at 80 unit per acre number. And next to that, you might have an employment use that, employs at least 40 people and would meet that standard.
So what is the example in Corvallis you used for the residential? I'm just trying to visualize.
Sure, yeah. So I'm sorry, I didn't include those slides. Oh, wow, look at this. Okay, so here's one. This is an affordable housing development. This is actually a historic structure from historic building in downtown Corvallis. 35 subsidized one-bedroom studio units. The density is actually 194 units per acre because the development site is less than a fifth of an acre. And so you can imagine, 4/5 of that site occupied by an employment use that, if you're at 40 jobs or more, you're going to meet that standard. So that's one example.
Thank you. That's helpful.
You bet. All right, I've taken up enough time probably. I know other members of the team want to talk about their portions of the rule, but thank you for the good questions.
Okay, so put the slides back up. There we go, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was like, back to parking. Wonderful. Thanks for your engagement. Obviously, we're here to answer the issues that you're interested in. So I'm glad to have that robust conversation. One of the key pieces of this rulemaking is reforming parking management. And we do that for lots of reasons. Forcing one-size-fits-all parking into every development means those costs of parking are imposed on every development, makes housing more expensive. It pushes land uses apart, which means it's less walkable. It imposes costs on business. So really, lots of different reasons that we think parking is an important thing to reform. The draft rules do three things. One is they kind of take some best practices from parking codes around Oregon and say, hey, everyone should be using these. The second is it says, hey, communities, choose one of three approaches on reforming parking. And the third is it requires most populous communities to do more parking management. On those three options in the middle, the first is to say, hey, we're going to let the market provide the parking that it needs. Let the diversity developments provide lots of parking or no parking or some parking as their needs are. And communities around the world have done that for a couple of decades. So we have pretty good data that seems to work as long as the on-street parking is managed for spillover. So that's option one. Options 2 and 3 say, hey, we're going to reduce parking where we know there's going to be less demand. And the data on that are pretty clear that it's near areas well served by transit, kind of in downtowns where there's a lot of mixed use. And option 2 also says, hey, let's make sure we adopt some policies that say, if you're not using parking, you don't have to subsidize parking for other people. So that's called unbundling parking. And you're paying for your rent for your parking space separate from your unit, either commercial or residential. So that sort of policies, choose 3 of 5 policies in that. Now, option 3 just says, hey, we're going to deregulate parking, not just near transit and for certain key uses, but for other types of uses, things like schools and bars and historic buildings, LEED certified buildings, that sort of thing. So those are the 3 options that communities have to choose one of. Next slide. So this is the more populous communities thing, over 100,000. I know Bend is pretty much there. Implement parking maximums. We've always required that under the previous transportation planning rules, but this provides a little bit more details on that. And it says, hey, if you're going to keep mandating everyone produce a bunch of parking, you should reflect that on-street parking has some value. And it's ask communities to price 5% of their on-street parking spaces at least 50 cents a day, and then 10% of on-street parking spaces. So just kind of recognizing that has value and creating a price signal there. So the over 150,000 doesn't apply to you. So we'll skip that. Next slide. The EV charging, yes. always have to look at the slide because we made some major revisions in this. What the EV charging does is it says, hey, we need to prep for the EV revolution. And as new buildings get built, they should install conduit. Not the wiring, not the charging stations themselves, but do it when it's cheap to put in the conduit. And so that's 20% of spaces, which is what the legislature already required. And then for residential, our rules say, hey, let's have 30% more spaces. Can be very simple wiring for those, but at least half of spaces in new, larger residentials should be ready to charge EVs. Next slide.
Okay, thank you, Evan. So unless there's any questions about parking or EV charging, I'm going to go ahead and move on with my part of the presentation. My name is Bill Holmstrom. I'm the Land Use and Transportation Planning Coordinator at DLCD. Thank you very much for having us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the transportation planning rules and changes that we're making there for how local governments do transportation system planning. And I want to be real clear here because I'm talking to the MPO TAC that, we're talking about rules for how the state guides local transportation system plans to be updated. Your key job is to update the federally required regional transportation plan. And, our rules, I think over the years have been a little bit confusing about how that works and how that interaction works. One of the main pieces of our rulemaking is really trying to be clear about who our rules apply to. They apply to local governments. They apply to the city of Bend. They don't apply to the Bend MPO, if that makes sense. It's a little bit unusual in your case because you have one city in your MPO and every other MPO has at least, I think, 3 in them. So it makes things a little bit easier for you guys, I think, but also sometimes a little bit like, where's that line there? But I did want to be clear about that because I think that has been a confusing piece for folks for a while. So the transportation planning rules, they've been on the books for about 30 years now, guiding local governments in how they do coordinated land use and transportation planning. Frankly, we're a lot better off here in the Oregon that has had these rules for 30 years than an Oregon that didn't have these rules for 30 years. We're doing a lot of good work, and a lot of good things have happened because we've had these rules and because local governments have taken them and done good work with their local planning. But we know from all the work that we've done, we need to do more to meet our climate and equity goals. So what I like to think is, we're building on what we've have on our success over the past few decades, and really just trying to, I like to say, turn up the volume on that. So if I can move my own slide here. We're putting it, renewed focus, and obviously local governments have been doing this for a long time, but renewed focus on making sure that we're planning complete, safe and connected networks, in particular for our pedestrian, bicycle, and public transportation networks. And when I talk about our pedestrian network, I want to be clear. I'm also talking about for a system for people who walk, but also use mobility devices. When I'm talking about bicycles, I'm talking about bicycles, e-bicycles, scooters, all those kind of devices that we keep inventing that are operated kind of that size and scale, that speed of bicycles do. So, not just bicycles. And we know that we've done a really good job over the past century or so of building out a complete network for cars and trucks to be able to drive around, and that's great. And we're going to continue to need to build that network out to serve new development, to make new connections. Absolutely, and the rules don't preclude that in any way. It's a matter of making sure that we're, spending some of that same attention on our other networks for other ways of being able to get around and making sure that those are complete as well, because they certainly aren't now. In particular, we want to prioritize those climate-friendly areas that Kevin talked about, that we're making sure those are places with an excellent level of transportation for folks to be able to have choices to get around, to meet their daily needs without having to get into a car. You might be able to meet your daily needs to get to work, school, shopping or medical appointments without having to get into a car, which is essentially a requirement in a lot of places right now. We want to make sure in particular also that we're looking at neighborhoods with underserved populations. These are places where that have experienced underinvestment or disinvestment over the years. Sometimes they've received investments that have been negative for those communities. We want to make sure that we're paying particular attention to those places, that we're providing investments that are helpful for those communities and can help provide choices for people that live there. And of course, we want to make sure that we're providing access to key destinations in the community so people can get to those key places without necessarily having to drive. So we also, in the rules, are setting out a framework for how local governments select projects within their plans. It's on a variety of prioritization factors. And in general, we want to make sure that the projects that are being selected in the city are working to meet the climate and equity goals that we're trying to achieve with this rulemaking. So it's a kind of an iterative process of prioritizing projects, of talking with underserved communities about their values and making sure that they are plugged into the prioritization process for how each community values and weights their priorities, and to come up with a prioritized list, and then eventually to a financially constrained list of projects that the community expects to be built over the planning period. And then we also are trying to broaden how we look at success in the transportation system. Right now, we have pretty limited tools for how we do that. It's mostly comes down to how many cars or trucks can get through an intersection during a certain time of day. That's not unimportant. We're not saying you have to get rid of that, but we want to make sure that we're looking at other values as well, whether those are safety, access to destinations, the ability of other modes of travel, pedestrians, bicyclists, transit to move around and get to destinations as well. Those are all important values that aren't necessarily captured in kind of those limited ways of looking at the transportation system now. So we're asking local governments to broaden their look there. And with that, I think we're heading into just real quick where we are in our rulemaking schedule. We're getting close to the end of our process. We've started our rulemaking, the governor's order came out in March of 2020, so just over 2 years ago. And that's when we began scoping the project. And our commission kicked off our rulemaking in September of 2020. So the last 18 months or so, we've been working on this project. We've had our advisory committee meet 11 times. They'll meet for the 12th time next week. Like Evan or someone noted, we met with our commission last week for their first formal public hearing on this. We've been meeting with them all along. They've been providing direction to us. But the first formal hearing was last week, and their second and final adoption hearing is in May 19th is when we expect them to adopt the rules. We'll see what happens. And then we expect the rules will become effective in June. There's a number of provisions in the rules that we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks here to make some adjustments, but to that kind of stagger out some of the requirements over the next few years to make sure that local governments are successful in being able to implement these rules, and that those deadlines are lined up with resources available from the state to make those happen. So with that, I think that's the end of our.
All right, we'll let Rick Williams has a question. And then Bill, if you could just send me the presentation when you're done, that'd be great. Or anyone at the MPO.
Yeah, we'll get that to you.
Bill, my plea is in the redo of the TPR for some simplicity in how it's laid out. And I'm not saying that myself or my prior manager are the sharpest tools in the shed, but with the second iteration of the TPR, we literally tried to turn it into a decision tree or a flow chart for about a week and couldn't do it because there was so many, if it's this, then you have to go back up to the top and consider this. Drafting administrative rules are not easy, but I hope that before it's promulgated, somebody sits down and goes, can a local jurisdiction logic their way through this? Because sometimes you get caught in logic loops. So that's my only plea is please take one more look at it and give us some element of simplicity if possible.
Yeah, thank you for that. And one of my key objectives for the next few weeks is to what I call sanding off the rough edges. And some of that has to do with making sure everything's connected to each other and everything. I tried to do that when I was building these rules, starting with rule 100 and say, just list out what are the things that go into TSP, and then you just go to those rules and you do those things and then you're good. What's happened is they've evolved and you start with, something that's really clean and easy, and you have, lots of cooks in the kitchen, and you have lots of stakeholders with lots of ideas and interests, and the evolution doesn't always end up in someplace that's quite as straightforward. So I take that to heart. I've tried to build it that way, and we're going to revisit that a little bit to the extent we can.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ari Mendez, and I was wondering about the whether cities will be required to adopt all of these recommendations. For example, Cody was describing, it sounded like almost like an audit of the the climate action plans. Will their recommendations be required to be adopted? And if so, what kind of enforcement mechanisms are there?
Cody, you want to try to tackle that?
Sure. Good question. So what the process I was describing, a lot of this is rule and requirement, and then there's a lot of back end that's the program. What we didn't mention here is that the executive order not only directed DLCD to come up with the rule amendments, but also for ODOT and DLCD to identify the financial means to stand them up. We've started off with $3.5 million from the ODOT Climate Office for some of that scenario planning and performance measure work. So we will be putting together contracts to kind of bring facilitators and consultants to the table to help you as a region get to those performance measures. But then the adoption would be the simple, like, here are the performance targets that we can adopt locally. So it's just kind of a lot of stuff that goes in the back end to come up with just a list of, here are the things we're measuring and here are our goals for the future for each of those. Then I did also want to mention that OTC just approved $15 million to support the planning efforts to get the adoptable products in the hands of local governments.
Thank you.
Bill, I don't know if you could maybe talk about a little bit about the TSP, the major and minor updates, because I think that's what.
Yeah, so local governments have transportation system plans. They've been required for a long time. I would say the existing version of the rules written in the 90s was written in a time when no one had a TSP yet. So they're really written to say, when you're doing your TSP for the first time, they didn't really say it like that, but we've tried to write it in a way that talks more, that assumes everyone has their TSP already, and folks will be doing updates along the way. Part of that is to say, if you're doing a major update or a minor update, and kind of different kind of pieces that go along with what have to be updated each time when you're doing that, and to kind of line up a little bit more closely with hopefully what local governments are doing already. Is that what you meant to ask, Cody, or? Okay.
Okay, so we'll move on to Robin Bora.
Yeah, have you had a chance to review Ben's urban renewal core area urban renewal district plan that was adopted a couple of years ago? And I don't know if you can even look at that independent of the rest of the city or not with these guidelines.
Kevin, that might be a CFA question, maybe.
Well, yeah, I guess the simple answer is no. We haven't had a chance to review the urban renewal district plan. Are there elements of it that would interact with climate-friendly area requirements, or?
Yeah, I mean, there should be. That was one of the objectives in developing that. But it would be interesting to know how it fits And I don't know from a state standpoint, if you'd be looking at the whole city, or can you look at a part of a city?
That's a good question. I can answer the second part of it, which is yes, it's a whole city analysis. So I mean, we are expecting, I'll be quite honest, we're expecting the primary CFAs in most areas, probably all areas, will be the existing downtown areas of many of these cities, because many of them, probably most of them, already have mixed use zoning. And so, you know, they're going to have some level of that type of development. But there are other opportunities elsewhere. As I mentioned, the idea of having satellite climate friendly areas as neighborhood centers also has some potential for GHG reduction and greater housing variety in other areas as well. So the first year study is really looking at all of those potential candidate areas and figuring out which ones make the most sense for each local government.
Thank you.
Okay, move on to David Thompson.
Thank you. More of a comment than a question, and I realize it's probably a little high level, but you know, I don't have a lot of confidence that what you've described is going to bring that curve you showed in the first slide anywhere near where it needs to be. And to be honest, I'm not sure the curve is low enough to start with. So I appreciate all the work that's going into this, but I think we still too much are in a mode of how can we do this without inconveniencing anybody too much? And folks, we are past that. I mean, when I hear people say, well, we shouldn't adopt this rule or that rule because it's going to create this problem or that problem, my response is, okay, so what are we going to adopt instead that will do at least that much? Because what we do instead is we don't do anything, or we water it down and we don't do enough. So my plea to everyone involved in this is, you know, we got to start being more aggressive or we're not going to succeed. And it just drives me crazy when I see, you know, plans to say, oh, okay, well, next time we update the TSP. Deschutes County is just finishing their TSP update. There's not going to be another TSP update for 10 years if nobody comes in, and unless somebody comes in and says, hey, we're going to update everybody's TSP and make sure that it includes, you know, this stuff. 10 years from now it's now an eternity in climate change. So anyway, my plea, thanks for listening.
No, thank you. And I think, you know, that's well taken. We're trying to balance a lot of things here. And you know, the key, you know, thing that we started this all off is we need to do enough to meet our targets. And we think we've got a framework built for local governments around the state to try to hit that, but not by itself, right? There's no silver bullet here. This is a piece of the puzzle. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. There's a lot of other actions that have to be taken, and a lot of other places other than our commission to make this work. And those all need to happen too.
Understand, and thank you for your work.
Dave. Appreciate Sharon Smith.
I promise this is my last question. Could we go back to the timing, the adoption timing slide? Because I want to make sure I understand the process. So you had the first public hearing last week, and what I heard you say was that you're still making changes and adding new things at the direction of the commission. Are you going to have, when are the kind of the final rules coming out, and will there be an opportunity for comment on those before the adoption hearing?
Yeah, thank you. So we'll have those draft rules out as part of our commission packet no later than 2 weeks ahead of that commission meeting. So that would be what, May 7th or 5th, I guess. So Cinco de Mayo. You'll have those draft rules come out. Gosh, we had the last rules come out on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. I wonder if interesting. Anyway, they'll be 2 weeks in advance, yeah, at least. And there's an opportunity for anyone to submit written testimony to the commission or provide oral testimony at that commission meeting. We had a number of 42 exhibits to that last one, Evan, is it something like that?
45.
45. Okay, well, somewhere I lost count. So definitely people have been sending in plenty of feedback, and we expect to receive a lot more. And we'll see what happens at the main meeting. If the commission feels, the commission, I'll be honest with you, is probably wanted to adopt this yesterday. They are ready to get this adopted and start the implementation process. But if they told us, if things aren't quite right, they don't feel comfortable adopting this, they're not going to go and adopt it. And so we're expecting we'll probably hold the hearing on the 19th, and then we may come back on the 20th, on the second day of their meeting, if there are small changes that need to be made. Or they'll push it back to their next meeting. They meet every other month. And I wouldn't count on that. Just every indication I've seen from them is that they're keen to adopt in May if they can.
Thank you. Just to follow up, and I appreciate the challenges of new rulemaking and getting it adopted, but I think it's really important that there's adequate time to identify glitches or unintended consequences. And if you're adding new stuff now, it feels like there is a real possibility that there's inadequate public review time on these rules. And that's just my perspective. And I think it's really important that we hear from people who actually are going to have to implement this if there are challenges and glitches that were unintended. Because what happens then is we have litigation, and that doesn't do anything.
Certainly. Yeah, no, that's well taken. We've had versions of these rules out since last summer of 2021. So we are trying, we're keeping the changes down to mostly having to do with, like I said, it's kind of sanding off the rough edges, making sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, that we have all of our, references match each other. We've had our attorney review this, but we're going to, kind of continue to polish it. That's the main thing. But then there are a handful of key policy issues that the commission did ask us to revisit. And so we're keeping those limited. They have to do with the timing, the implementation over the next few years. That's kind of one key piece, and making some changes potentially there to provide local governments some more flexibility. They have to do with making some updates to how local governments are directed to plan for their bicycle transportation system, and providing some more concrete guidance to them in the rules about how they do that. The other pieces have to do with, I think, the climate-friendly areas and how we use tools to promote affordable housing within those climate-friendly areas. And is there one more thing, Kevin, in the CFAs that we want to make sure that we're?
Yeah, there is the block length. We're going to be looking at block length standards for large redevelopment sites.
So it's a pretty discrete set of things that we're really revisiting over this next few months. And I've been trying to, we had a meeting Monday where we went over these things just to make sure, and they can, my staff can tell you, I've been harping on this for a couple of months now. Like, we're almost done. Like, let's focus on the stuff that really needs to be focused on. And so that's where I think we are. But of course, yeah, we want to make sure we get those draft rules out that are updated as early as possible. We committed to the commission that we would also identify clearly where the changes are being made from the previous draft of the rules to these new draft of the rules so people can see what changes have been made and which rules have been changed. So we're trying the best we can with the resources and the time we've got to make that work. Thank you.
Okay, Peter Russell.
First, I feel your pain having written development code and having written comp plan policy. So yeah, I truly feel your pain. I've been there, lived that. The one question I had, well, two-part is one, how are you going to measure the greenhouse gases? I mean, I haven't tracked it. Is DEQ doing modeling? And so how do you check that? And then what's the percentage that the Bend MPO has of the state's greenhouse gases? You know, I'm looking at some sort of scalable aspect of it. And again, good luck on all this.
Probably a good question for me to try to answer. So really good question. It depends on what you want to measure the greenhouse gas emissions from. We have various different, I like to think of it as a big pie. We have every, greenhouse gas emitted from the state, from different sectors, from transportation, alone is almost 40%. Within that, you have freight, airplane travel, household travel. So our targets at DLCD were directed from the legislature to look at household travel. So we kind of really narrowed down on that slice, and which really takes up a pretty big slice of that transportation pie slice. So we do modeling, and we've been doing that since 2011. We've had a series of different models that look at the projections, but DEQ does do greenhouse gas inventory. This work, the CFAC work, is a part of a larger effort. It's called Every Mile Counts. It's ODOT, DLCD, DEQ, and Department of Energy. And a part of that work is we're standing up a performance dashboard to track, the actual emissions coming out. But short of putting a counter on everyone's tailpipe, we don't do. I mean, it's kind of like how we do VMT. No one's really counting every odometer click. We have models and proxies to kind of project those out. And of course, a lot of what we do as planners is we're working in the year 2040 and 2050. So we're kind of checking the changes between, doing various policy options out in the future.
So let me ask it a different way. So what's Ben's proportionate share? If you've got 100% for, the state or the MPOs, what's Ben's proportionate share of greenhouse gases?
Ben's greenhouse gas emission target is 20% in 2040, and I believe it's 25.
No, what's the emissions from the modeling, the baseline?
Oh, the emissions baseline. I don't have that information.
Okay, fair enough.
Follow up with some of the folks over ODOT or DEQ. And like I said, it really depends on what specific you're talking about, what source of greenhouse gas emissions. Is it from household cars, planes, trains, automobiles, power plants?
We have cows.
And cows and people.
Okay, Tyler.
Yeah, do we have any other questions? I think we need to wrap up here in just a minute so we can get to our other agenda item. Anybody have any closing questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. I think this was really useful.
Thank you for having us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. Very informative.
All right, Andrea, I'm going to pull up
Okay.
presentation. We'll let Andrea jump in here for our next agenda item, talking about the surface transportation block grant funding.
So we want to bring the topic of distribution of STBG funds to the TAC for discussion prior to bringing it to the policy board. So the policy board is going to be revisiting how our annual allocations of STBG funds are distributed, and this is for two things. So number one, the additional amounts that we'll be receiving for years 2022, 2023, and 2024. And these additional amounts are based on updated ODOT estimates. So the original estimates were in 2020, and the board had approved a distribution method for those. And that was part of the development of our Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program, or MTIP, at that time. And a reminder, our MTIP is our 4-year program of projects that shows how funds will be spent over that time frame. And second, the board will be revisiting distribution for the estimated allocations for future years. So years 2025, 2026, and 2027. And this is for development of our next MTIP. So our fiscal year 2024 through 2027 MTIP. And again, so we're not looking for a formal recommendation from the TAC, more of a discussion item to gather TAC feedback. And I'll go into the details of each one of these items here in the next slide. So go ahead, Tyler. So some background here. In April 2020, the board adopted the 2021-2024 MTIP. And what that did is it established how the estimated allocations for those years would be distributed. So they approved a process at that time where 60% of our STBG dollars would go to the City of Bend streets for maintenance and preservation, 15% to a competitive application process, and 25% to MPO required planning. And the table on the right shows what that looks like per year for those original estimates. So essentially, per year, the city would get just over $700,000 for maintenance and preservation. The MPO would have about $180,000 a year for the competitive application process, and then for our required planning, approximately $300,000. Next slide, Tyler. Fast forward to the next year, so April 2021, we are made aware that actually our STBG for fiscal year 2021 is $127,000 higher than what we had than what the original estimates were. So that following month in March of 2021, the board awarded those additional funds to projects that weren't fully funded from our last project application process. So those additional dollars have been spent. As far as any future additional funds for years 2022 through 2024, the board had tabled that discussion on how to distribute those dollars until spring of 2022. So essentially now. So here, our current situation. So the board is going to be revisiting distribution for the estimated annual additional funds that you see in red there for 2022 to 2024, as well as the estimated annual allocations for years 2025 through 2027, and those are colored in blue. So around $300,000 per year additional for 2022 through 2024, and then for our future allocation estimates, they're coming in at around $1.6 million per year. Next slide. Okay. So here are some possible scenario examples for the policy board. And I'll go through these. And then on the next slide, I have a table that actually gives some example of what these dollar amounts would look like. So the first example we have is, let's say we just apply those same original approved splits to all of these dollars, to the additional funds, to the future allocation estimates, that 60% to City of Bend streets, 15% to our application process, 25% to MPO planning. The second example would be to roll those additional funds, the dollars in red, into our next project application process, which will begin this fall, and then take those previously approved splits and apply those to the future allocation estimates shown in blue. A third example would be to again roll those additional funds into our next project application process. And then as far as the future allocation estimates, that approximate 1.6 million per year, is to freeze the amount that goes to the city for maintenance and preservation at around 723,000, which was the originally approved amount, that 60%. And then the remaining future allocation amounts would go to our next application process, as well as MPO planning. As far as the exact dollar amount that we need for MPO planning, we're still kind of working on that, but it's generally around probably 300 to 350,000 a year. Yeah, Henry.
Andrea, can you remind us how often the grant application process opens? Like, what's the time period? Is it every other year, every 4 years? I can't remember.
So our MTIP is every 4 years, but the process for the applications is approximately every 3 years. 2 to 3 years, depending, because you're looking at your for out year dollars. Yeah.
Sure.
Sharon.
Oh, go ahead, Sharon.
Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm muted. I was just going to ask, I don't know, I don't remember how the 60, 15, 25 split was developed to begin with.
That was developed and approved by the policy board.
Based on
the amount that we were getting, the amount that we had been, the past amounts we had originally been providing to the city of Bend, as well as the fact that the application process was new. As far as any history beyond that, Tyler, could you jump in for that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start and then Hobie if I miss anything. So just a little bit of history in terms of up until 2015, maybe, I can't remember the exact year, but up until that time, 100% of the funds were given to the city of Bend for its street preservation program. And then there was a lot of stuff started to happen around that time where we were getting requests to help fund different planning projects. Our budget internally, our operating budget was actually declined for a few years, kind of in the middle of this last decade. And we laid, I had to essentially Hovey cut her down to halftime and that type of thing. And so we worked through a process with our board back then to start moving small amounts of money towards other things. And as we continued those discussions, I think where we landed that 60% number, it's close to, like 725,000. The board a few years ago, they didn't want to reduce the funding to streets. They wanted to try and preserve it at least a steady level going forward, if that makes sense, and then push the excess out towards other things. That makes sense, Sharon?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks.
Peter, you have a question?
So a couple things. I mean, one out of the three, I like example 3, but much as Tyler has recapped, I still remember the battles of trying to get more money to MPO planning, because the P in MPO is planning, not paving. So what I'd suggest is, particularly given the presentation we just heard from DLCD, that you shift more money towards MPO planning, because you pretty much have an avalanche coming down, and then less for paving.
Well, and I think, and thank you for that, Peter, because I think that's one of the things we're going to be talking to City of Bend staff about, is trying to determine, what their costs are going to be to implement all these rules. And we know that the OTC has set aside money statewide, but that's for all 8 MPO areas to do work. And the real focus right now, at least, is on the 3 large MPO areas. So Portland, Salem, and Eugene. And so we very well may need to push some of our money to help implement some of the early phases of this. And several years ago, when ODOT was having planning funding shortages, we provided a pretty significant amount of money to help develop the Parkway plan. We funded, the majority of the ITS plan update, that type of thing. And so we've pushed a lot of money out, kind of over time towards planning projects in particularly the last 5 or 6 years. And I can see us doing that again going forward.
Yeah, and that's still a number that we need to, that's TBD as far as the amount for MPO planning. Yeah, Rick?
I'm just curious, and Tyler might know this. Is it fairly common within MPOs that your STBG funds go for street preservation work? It just seems counterintuitive that a planning organization is spending their discretionary funds on maintenance.
Well, I mean, Andrea's, dug into it a little bit.
Yeah, it varies across the different MPOs. Some give all of it to that. Some give none of it and all of the dollars go to a competitive application process, or some give, a dedicated amount to transit. It's really across the board.
Yeah, we're the only small MPO that uses some of our STBG funding for planning purposes.
Oh, okay.
The other four, 100% of the money gets pushed out for whether it's projects or transit service, that type of thing. And so we're unique in that sense in Oregon. The three large MPOs, they all use a decent percentage of their STBG funding to help with both their internal planning as well as other planning, efforts within their respective regions.
Okay. No, I just always feel that like you've been very helpful filling gaps in our planning program when we're trying to push things out within the MPO. And I always think, the P in MPO is for planning, not for paving. So I would support more of it going towards planning efforts, because a city has the ability to tax, and they can raise money to pay for their pavement preservation if they choose to. My 2 cents. Thanks.
Dave?
Thanks. So I also believe that we should be directing more funding to planning. I think street preservation is a very worthwhile activity. Clearly, we don't want to have to go rebuild streets because we didn't take care of them. But I also agree with the statement that the city of Bend has other ways to fund that. And basically they're taking a politically easy way by taking this money that's being handed to them and using it to do this. So I would say, let's try and reduce the percentage split going to street preservation, at least by, down to 50% or something, and direct everything else to planning and the competitive project process. And I still don't think there's probably going to be enough money here that people are going to come to us wanting to use that competitive process to fund a new street, but I think we ought to make it clear that that's not part of what we're going to do with that money, that we're going to follow the same trajectory as the state now, and basically say, hey, we're not building new streets other than as part of developments, but we're not going to be spending huge amounts of money on building new arterials and things like that. We're going to be using it to advance these other priorities that we've just heard about that have been underfunded for years. That's my 2 cents.
Thanks,
Robin?
Dave. I just wanted to, can I just say,
Go ahead, Tyler.
quick time check, because we're right at 11:30.
Sure.
Do folks can people stay on for like just 5 more minutes so Andrea we can address Robin's question, then Andrea has 1 or 2 more slides.
Yeah, go ahead, Robin.
Yeah, I'm wondering if the pave pres could be broken into maybe 2 buckets. One is basic pave pres and maybe keeps that at a set amount. But then one is pave pres linked to a project that can implement walk, bike, low stress facilities. There's a few roads in town that don't have sidewalks or don't have bike lanes. They're coming up for pave pres projects, but those still will not have sidewalks or bike lanes when the pave pres is done. Because typically those are just a maintenance run and they just, fix the existing pavement, but they don't have the ability to widen and add the buffered bike lanes or the sidewalks. So wondering if there's, you can kind of hit two birds with one stone by breaking that into two different buckets.
I don't know, Tyler, if you want to say something, but I'm thinking that that could so right now in our competitive application process, the streets for maintenance and preservation, those types of projects, since they're already getting 60% of our STBG dollars, they can't apply for they can't submit an application related to that. But maybe in that case, we could open up the competitive application process for those kinds of projects. I think that's something we can, discuss later. How we do that. Tyler, you have something to add?
Yeah, I think that's something, yeah, we could discuss. Because I think, you raise a good issue or a good question there, Robin. We've got, a lot of the designated neighborhood greenways and low stress type facilities, are on neighborhood streets or local streets. And I know just from my immediate neighborhood, one of those greenways is on a corridor now that is becoming, borderline dangerous to bike on for what I would consider to be inexperienced cyclists.
Yeah.
So we have street signage up and pushing, encouraging people to use it, but the facility itself isn't what I would consider to be a safe facility for children and, inexperienced riders to be riding on a regular basis.
Yeah, so we've got the alligator cracking. And also some of the arterials, like Butler Market is coming up for a paved pres project beyond Brinson. So just heading east of Brinson. And it's 3 lanes plus bike lanes, and it's only 43 feet wide or something like that. And so it doesn't have the ability to have a low stress bike lane. But if the project could have enough money in the paved pres, they could widen the shoulders out. So things like that.
Tyler, you want to move to the next slide? So this was simply plugging those written examples into the dollars that we have and what that would look like as far as example dollar amounts.
Just a few thoughts. I like all the work that's gone into all these examples, and I think it's very, very helpful to see kind of how this money can get broken out. I really like the idea of increasing funding for MPO planning. I love the competitive application. I think it's a great program. And I'd love to see more dollars go to that, but I also understand the need for the city of Bend street preservation. So I guess I don't really have any strong feelings, but I would say if we are going to make adjustments to the percentage that either one of these categories are getting, it would be really great if that was somehow rooted in what the need, like if the MPO could say we need 4% more every year for staff salaries or to fulfill our work program, which I know that you guys are always tweaking, or we had this many unfunded projects in the competitive application. I would feel really comfortable supporting a recommendation to the policy board on those if we had a little bit of that information. Otherwise, without that, I think just the existing splits and the existing model would be adequate to apply to the additional funds.
Yeah, so at this point, simply discussion item. We're not looking for a formal recommendation. But yeah, as far as more detailed info that we would have to come back with that.
Yeah, because I also really see the value in street preservation for bicycle and pedestrian transportation. Asphalt quality affects bikes and peds, I think, to a larger degree actually than it does vehicles. And, just last night we were talking to our board and the city about teaming up for Riverfront Street. And one of the potential funding sources for that project would be additional dollars from the city street preservation fund. And it's already being funded by a large amount by the competitive application process.
Got it. Thanks. Next slide, Tyler. So are there any other comments, thoughts on this agenda item before I move to kind of going over the next steps? So next, at the policy board meetings, they'll be, discussing this topic and determining how these funds will be distributed. June and July, both at the TAC and policy board meetings, staff will be bringing back the details of our competitive application process as far as, do we want to adjust any of the criteria that is in there or the process itself. And then in September, we will be opening the project application process. The submittal will open. And that's all I have for this topic.
Thank you, Andrea. Does anybody have any burning issues or updates they want to share, like just briefly before we wrap up the meeting? All right. I see we have one or two public or just citizens on here. Any feedback from or input from our non-TAC members that are still with us? All right, if not, we will be meeting again on May 4th at 10 a.m. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.